The repressive hypothesis is the theory according to which sex was once free, but twilight soon fell upon this bright day, at which point, first with Christianity and then again with Victorianism, sex was repressed, and we are still struggling to free ourselves of this repressive inheritance. The repressive hypothesis is teleological because it has an idea of the sexually liberated society toward which we are slowly progressing and striving, a society of free love in which we can express our sexuality both in acts and words without the baggage of Christian morality and Victorian prudishness. The sexual liberation movement embraced this narrative and saw itself as struggling to bring back the bright day when at last sex will be good again. The repressive hypothesis is also a universalizing history of sex in that it assumes that repression works on a sexuality that was always already there, that is, an innate, primordial, and natural drive. Both the universalizing view of sex and the teleological view of sexual liberation are called into question by the history of sexuality. For Foucault, sex is a socially constituted phenomenon, thoroughly cultural, contingent, and caught up in shifting forms of knowledge power that the sexual liberation movement has extended rather than escaped. The repressive hypothesis assumes a negative relation between sex and power. Power is thought to forbid sex, to deny the very existence of many kinds of sex, to try not to see it or talk about it, to censor and silence sex. According to the repressive hypothesis, the only kind of sex that is permitted is between heterosexual married people, and even this should be discreet, utilitarian, and productive. These are the monotonous nights of the Victorian bourgeoisie, in which there is a single locus of sexuality, the parents' bedroom, in Foucault's words. In critiquing what he calls the repressive hypothesis, Foucault's most direct target was Marxist Freudians, such as the German psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich and the social theorist Herbert Marcuse. Reich and Marcuse's writings from the 20s through the 50s influenced the countercultural class struggles and sexual liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. Marxist Freudians responded critically to works such as Civilization and its Discontents, where Freud argued that sexual repression is necessary for civilization. For Freud, most sexual urges are necessarily sublimated into the energy needed for work and progress. Although psychoanalysis could bring sexual repressions to light, its ultimate goal was not to abolish all repressions, but to eliminate only a select few while fortifying the rest. For Freud, psychoanalysis should aim not to liberate sexual instincts, but to domesticate them. Marxist Freudians such as Marcuse disagreed. In Eros and Civilization, Marcuse argued that it was specifically the sexual lives of the working class that were being repressed so as to be channeled into alienated labor. For Marcuse, Freud had failed to think beyond the bourgeois morality of his time, but the role of psychoanalysis should be to help patients overcome sexual repression to bring about a non-repressed civilization. While the most direct target of Foucault's argument is the Marxist Freudians, and he is concerned to refute Marxist ideas about power and Freudian notions about sex throughout his book, he also thinks that, more generally, almost everyone at this time, even if not a card-carrying Marxist or Freudian, held a certain view of sexual repression. This was the view of the sexual liberation movement of the 60s and 70s, and it still holds true today. We think that the Victorian age entailed a new prudishness and that it was only in the late 20th century that people began to break free of this sexual repressiveness. According to the repressive hypothesis, although the sexual liberation movement is long since underway, there is still work to be done. We are still other Victorians, inheritors of a sexually repressive legacy. And yet, Foucault observes that, far from being silent on sex, we talk about it constantly, even if the way we talk about it has changed. We now talk about sex in ways that are informed by authoritative discourses. Thus, even when we exchange sexual secrets with friends and lovers, we take up expert discourses. We engage in analysis and self-analysis. We taxonomize our sexualities. We see sex as a health issue. We are concerned with what is sexually normal, and we talk about sex as if we were describing something important. Speech about sex is understood as a quasi-scientific and confessional revelation of who we are, a way to understand and describe our nature, character, and identity. It is odd for Foucault that we believe in the repressive hypothesis because it is clear that we live in a society inundated with sexual discourses. Today, sex is an omnipresent theme in television, film, and advertising. Pornography occupies the majority of the internet. Sexologists are continually on radio and talk shows, and we devote courses to sex at universities. Yet, despite all this evidence to the contrary, we still frequently hear people talk about sex as repressed. Why would the repressive hypothesis have such staying power, although it is refuted by so much evidence around us? Foucault's response is that this discourse on modern sexual repression holds up well, owing no doubt to how easy it is to uphold. This theory is easy to uphold for two reasons. First, by placing the dawn of sexual repression at the beginning of the 17th century, we make sexual repression correspond with the rise of capitalism. It is then easy to argue that the only kind of sex that would be permitted, especially for the proletariat, would be the kind that reproduces the labor force. This Marxist explanation is too simplistic for Foucault. However, Foucault rejects the Marxist interpretation of sexual repression by showing that power is not inflicted from above on those below. On the contrary, in the era that saw the rise of capitalism, the bourgeoisie inflicted their sexual inquiries and ethics on themselves rather than the proletariat. The bourgeoisie submitted themselves to scientific study, subjected their own wives and children to psychiatric and pedagogical forms of disciplinary power. They did not send their workers to psychiatrists or prevent the proletariat's children from masturbating. For Foucault, as we will see, modern power does not move from above to those below, but circulates, and usually it is those who try to wield power who are first submitted to it. The prison warden is himself subjected to surveillance, and the clergy, who insist that everyone needs to confess, are the very people who confess most frequently. Similarly, the bourgeois scientists who examine sexuality are affected by the power effects of their studies long before the working classes. The second reason that the repressive hypothesis is easy to uphold is that it is gratifying. This is what Foucault calls the speaker's benefit. By describing sex as repressed, we make speaking about sex transgressive. He writes, "A person who speaks about sex feels that he upsets established law. He somehow anticipates the coming freedom. We are conscious of defying established power. Our tone of voice shows that we know we are being subversive, and we ardently conjure away the present and appeal to the future, whose day will be hastened by the contribution we believe we are making." By positing sex as repressed, we thus derive the benefit of feeling that we are engaged in a serious emancipatory political task when we talk about sex. We, moreover, get to feel that we are contributing to the generation of knowledge. Just by speaking of sex, we are thus able to believe we are contributing to science, emancipating ourselves and our society from an oppressive sexual censorship, and paving the way to a more sensual future. With these three positive ends, talking about sex becomes a laudable activity. Indeed, far from being a forbidden activity, speaking about sex has gained enough legitimacy to be enshrined in academia and made into science. Indeed, talking about sex is so important today that such talk even has a market value. For Foucault, the very existence of psychoanalysis, or the fact that listening could be commodified, indicates not so much that sex is repressed or silenced, but that we talk so much about it that there are not enough people to listen. Despite these reasons to be skeptical of the repressive hypothesis, Foucault does not want to deny that there was ever any censorship of sex. Obviously, these forms of repression have existed, and we can point to any number of examples. What he wants to argue, however, is that in the last few centuries, the relationship between sex and power has been much more complicated and positive than such instances of prohibition, and that even these instances of repression have had productive effects. The relationship between sex and power is not fundamentally characterized by negation. Rather, what is remarkable, what we need to attend to, is the fact that there has been a proliferation of discourses about sex, and these discourses have been creative. They have produced sexualities rather than, or even while, prohibiting them. Far from sex being taboo, for power to get a hold on sex, it required data, which meant that it required people to speak. The sciences of sex required sexual confessions, and this is exactly what the sexual liberation movement provided. misunderstanding the relationship between sex and power as repressive, the sexual liberation movement incites us to come out of our closets, to break the silence. This, however, has not so much been a resistance to power, but an extension of power. Foucault will argue that such comings out of closets are exactly what needed to take place for power to take hold of our bodies and the population.